Okay, let's, I guess I need to switch the lights here, don't I? Or turn them down a bit. Yeah. Okay, so, on the agenda today. All right, so we're going to finish up. We got a couple slides left on religious landscape here. I apologize. I just put up the slides for the next unit, which is the nuns. It slipped my mind to do it last night, so I just put them on eClass a second ago. So they are there now, so you can go and download them kind of whenever you are able to. Okay, so I guess just a reminder, if you want to take a look at your second midterm, I'm going to have a time next week, like just in the afternoon, where people can drop by, or if that doesn't work, you can make an appointment with me and we can go over it. Don't leave that too long because obviously, we don't want to, we want it to be useful to you. So, and my time is really going to fill up as the semester comes to a close here. Okay, so what were we talking about last time? We were talking about the religious landscape, and especially, right, what is really notable about it is the growth of the nuns. And we ended off on this slide with Philip Jenkins at Baylor University, giving a little bit of nuance to this question of the nuns, right? This idea of the nuns as a new religious phenomenon, I think important for Jenkins, right? He thinks a lot of it is actually just a changing approach to self-identification, right? That people who used to be kind of marginally attached to religious life now have stopped identifying because a lot of the social pressures no longer exist to do so, right? So it's probably, according to Jenkins, it's probably not so much that people have really changed their beliefs, right? It's not like millions of deeply religious people have walked out the door of their religious congregations. It is that a bunch of marginally attached people just stopped identifying as religious. Okay. So this, the kind of contrary opinion to Pew's, right? So contrary opinion not to Jenkins, but to Pew, is also expressed by another sociologist, Glenn Stanton. Stanton is a sociologist, right? PhD trained. He doesn't work at a university though, unlike Jenkins. He is the director of global family formation studies at Focus on the Family, which is an evangelical Christian group headquartered in Colorado Springs. That in the past was very much involved in kind of the culture wars, and now I think has become a lot less involved in them. But what does Stanton say? And he wrote this whole book, which is The Myth of the Dying Church, which is a really interesting read. You can see the subtitle, right? How Christianity, oh, you can't see it because I'm circling it in red on red, so that's not going to work. What have I done? I'll put it in yellow. Here we go. Ta-da, there, we can circle in yellow now. Right, so how Christianity is actually thriving in America and the world. So one of the things that Stanton or a few things that Stanton makes a point on. So he too kind of takes issue with Pew's reading of the data, and he thinks that probably what we're seeing from Pew is an exaggeration, maybe a little bit of clickbait in order to get lots of people to, click on them, view their ads, and also probably to donate to Pew so they get more kind of research dollars at the end of the day. And like Jenkins, Stanton doesn't think that the nuns are a particularly new category, right? Or even one that's actually particularly grown. What he says is he thinks Christianity in particular is going through a period of clarification where all of those who were, I'm going to underline it, marginally affiliated have now stopped bothering as the pressure to be affiliated fades, right? It used to be that everybody in the US had some kind of religious affiliation, or virtually, right? So you had to be very much a kind of renegade, socially, to say that you were an atheist, right? That put you very much on the outs in American society. Now, as we go through the 90s, okay, so one of the things that's kind of been posited about this is that, especially during the period of the Cold War, right? So where the world was split between the United States and the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was an officially atheist country, right? A communist country with official atheism, an identity as religious and American sort of got merged, right? So Christian and American sort of got merged together because it was the United States pitted against those godless atheists in the Soviet Union. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, that kind of emphasis disappears, right? And so from that comes a kind of delinking of the necessity of being Christian if you are also a patriotic American, right? So, in theory, and I don't know how much I actually buy the, Soviet Union connection, but it's something that a lot of people definitely posit. That once that pressure was no longer there to, be religious so that you could be pitted against, those godless Russians, then, that pressure faded away and people started to be more comfortable affiliating as nothing in particular. Maybe their family had been Methodist or Anglican, or Presbyterian or whatever. And then they were just like, well, I never go, so I'm just going to say nothing in particular. And it's a kind of snowball effect, right? As more people are comfortable with it, more people start identifying that way. Now, one thing that Stanton does talk about that I think is important is the growth of what he says are the non-denominational evangelical churches, right? So I'm going to confuse you with terms because we've been talking about the nuns, and this is a term that gets thrown in with the nuns. And in another class that I taught, I wrecked the class with this question. People just got it confused, and I could tell where people put this question in ChatGPT because ChatGPT had no idea what it was talking about. The growth of the nuns is sometimes contrasted with the growth of the nons, right? By which we mean non-denominational Christians. So basically, non-denominational Christians are basically, if you drive around Edmonton for long enough, you'll bump into this, right? You're going to bump into a church that's like the River Church or Life Church or, I don't know, there's a bench for it right at the bus stop here, or the big bus terminal over by the LRT for Celebration Church. These are all what are called non-denominational churches, right? Because they don't belong to a bigger church body, right? So it's not like they're part of the Anglican Church or the Catholic Church or the Presbyterian Church. And for whatever reason, these sort of deinstitutionalized churches, the nons, have been extremely successful in the last few years. As most other forms of Christianity have been declining, the nons have actually been doing relatively well. Now, when I say relatively well, it's not to say that they're replacing the decline in other churches. They're not, right? The decline of other churches still overwhelms the growth of the nons, but they are doing relatively well as religious kind of congregations do. Okay, other things that Stanton says, new churches are popping up all over the place, and he says, especially in certain parts of the States, there's a great boom in firms that specialize in church construction. Now, I've actually seen Ryan Burge kind of contradict this data because new church builds are considerably down, right? And I said this last time, right? Church planting or the opening of new Protestant churches, has kind of flipped into the negative, right? They're losing more Protestant churches per year than they're opening. So there's some things to contradict that particular point. But this is, I think, the big point, and we saw that in the chart from Ryan Burge that I showed you either last time or I think it was last time. That chart where the nuns go like this and the main line goes like this. The growth of the nuns for Stanton, and I think he's mostly right here, is principally driven by the collapse of mainline Protestantism, right? Which used to be a huge percentage of the American population, and now has almost completely collapsed. What was it? I was listening to a podcast with Ryan Burge the other day. Just in case you were wondering if I think about this stuff all the time when I'm not in class, I do. And anytime I see Ryan post on his Substack or on his Twitter that he was on a podcast, I like immediately jump in there and listen to the whole thing. And I lost my train of thought. One of the things that he was talking about is that he, on this book that I talked about last time, The Great De-Churching, they did a bunch of research, right? They did a bunch of surveys. And basically what they found is like in this key kind of like 18 to 24-year-old demographic. So they did about 3,000 surveys as part of one of the waves of this book that they were working on. They were only able to find 30 mainline Protestants in that 18 to 24-year-old demographic through this like huge survey. So like this demographic, and that's your growth demographic in lots of ways, is almost entirely absent from the mainline churches. So, I mean, this has been a story for a long time. I used to have in this slide deck, actually it was written by Stanton, an editorial in the Wall Street Journal that said, mainline Protestantism has 20 Easters left. That was about 5 years ago, so I suppose it now has 15 Easters left. Basically, within 15 years, this group is going to be basically gone completely. So there are some implications for this. One of them, according to Stanton, is that the growth of the nuns, should eventually just kind of flatline. That's a flat line. Sorry, terrible. My doodles are the worst. Why? Because if they're mostly cannibalizing this group, once you run out of those people and they all die off, there won't be anyone else to kind of draw into the ranks of the nuns. There are reasons to, I do think evangelicals and Catholics are still contributing quite a bit to the growth of the nuns, so I don't think Stanton's story there is entirely complete. But I do think that, especially, I should just go back and look at it. Back. I'm going to give you all epileptic seizures, I'm sorry. This chart kind of says it all, right? The growth of these two lines is so much the inverse of one another that basically I buy the kind of story that the growth of the nuns has been mostly driven by the total collapse of the main line. Sorry. I should just pepper that graph every other slide so I can refer back to it. Okay. Ooh, that slide got messed up. I don't know why. Okay. So, what do I have on this slide? All right. The non-denominationals, right? So just talking about, again, the nons, and make sure, I don't know, if I ask a question about this on the exam, and I ask about the nons, and you start talking to me about the nuns, that's a big fat 0. Just so you know. And maybe not. Maybe a 3. I might be generous. Who knows? Now you've been warned. I didn't warn my other class. Okay, so when we talk about the non-denominationals, right? Basically, if we look at, this chart, we see, this is our main line. Again, thanks to Ryan Burge. What did I even do in this whole lecture series if I didn't have a bunch of charts that he posts on Twitter? I have no idea. He is an invaluable source of data. So, the main line kind of peaks out above 30%, somewhere in the late 1970s, and declines, down. The nons, not the nuns. The nons, kind of start in the mid-aughts, right? So probably about 3% there. And they've grown, in terms of, their percent of the population to somewhere a little bit south of 15%. But it's not as explosive a growth as the nuns, but it's still a pretty good amount of growth. So these non-denominational churches are growing steadily. Again, they're not making up that difference because, they're not up here. But they do go a ways to kind of alleviating some of the dramatic decline in Christianity in the United States, a little bit. And the fact that this movement, of the nons is much more developed in the US than in Canada probably speaks to a little bit probably is one of the reasons that the nuns have grown faster in Canada than in the US, right? The nons and that strong evangelical movement have, if anything, kind of staunched the bleeding a little bit when it comes to people leaving religion. Okay. We talk about youth and religion. We'll talk about deinstitutionalization. I think that has a lot to do with it as well. I think the nons, people have moved into these non-denominational churches, especially younger people, specifically because they hate institutions, right? Or they're suspicious of institutions, and these are the least institution-y institutions that ever did institution. I think that was a sentence in English. Okay, other little bits of kind of trivia. So where do the nons come from, right? So the bulk of them, and this is, people identified as non-denominational, right, through basically 5 decades. The bulk of them, right, upward of 60% have always come from evangelicals. In the 70s, right, and the 80s, 22% of them were mainline Protestants. That number has gone down considerably, right? Hit single digit in the 2000s and is just 10% in the 2010s. Why has it gone down so much? Well, there's no mainline Protestants left, right? You can't kind of switch religious traditions if you don't exist, right? Catholics, weren't contributing a lot in the 1970s, but we see that Catholics, have increased kind of steadily in terms of how many people were raised Catholic and now identify as non-denominational. So there's a strong movement from, Catholic to non-denominational as well, right? Again, I think this speaks to a strong deinstitutionalization, right? Where people have become suspicious of the Roman Catholic Church and its kind of institutional status. But for a number of people, they didn't want to leave Christianity altogether, so they found themselves sort of in non-denominational Christianity. And then no religion, right? Some percent of people who are raised with no religion ended up in non-denominational Christianity, and then something else, right? A small number. So this could be people converting from other religions, right? Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, whatever, and becoming kind of, non-denominational Christians. That's not an altogether uncommon story either. Okay. So, oh yes, income. One of the things that's kind of become true, right? So if we look at kind of income, one of the questions is always like, does wealth lead to lower religious service attendance, right? As people get richer, do they, so this is kind of thinking about this deprivation thesis a little bit, right? Are the poor more likely to attend religious services than are the wealthy, right? And this is by, this is income, and this is also different levels of education, right? So, what am I doing here? Sorry, okay. So if we look at the 2010s, right, basically as people with a college degree, if they were poorer, tended to attend religious services more often, right? So they were, in terms of, I think this is weekly religious attendance, right? Somewhere close to 40% of them would have been attending religious services. It was lower for people with less education, right? With just some college, it's here, and with just high school, it's much lower, right? In the kind of high 20s. Okay, and basically what you saw is as people got richer, right, they actually tended to attend religious services less in the 2010s. Now, what you see in the kind of data from, so this is from Cooperative Election Study. It's a really good set of data that's been collected for a really, really long time as well. So that's not the 2010s, that's actually the year 2010, sorry. So what we see basically as of 2022 is that, total attendance is down considerably, right? So there's no kind of number here that comes close to that above 35% for those people with a college degree. So people with a college degree now are going less, but that line has basically kind of flattened out, right? So that basically now, whether you make more money or less money and have a college degree, more or less doesn't affect whether you attend religious services weekly or more. And again, while these lines do move a little bit more for high school and some college, basically they're pretty flat as well, right? But actually, the high school or less, as they make more money, actually are now attending religious services a little bit more. Okay, so I think that's interesting, right? It doesn't seem that we seem to have hit a moment where now we can say, well, whatever Marx thought, this is one data point, so maybe I shouldn't be too definitive, But income now in the United States, at least, doesn't seem to be affecting religious service attendance as much. As you get richer, you don't immediately sort of become less religious, though that was true in 2010. The other thing that I do want to kind of note is that I think is interesting. It's interesting in this slide, right? Level of education, I think, is really, really interesting in the sense that our most religious kind of cohort in both of these kind of data points is our college graduates, right? It's actually people who've gone to college. And this is, I think, an enduring a thing that we're seeing more, and something that is really worth noting is that now the working class, right, and people without a college degree are actually the least likely to be in part of religious congregations, right? They're almost entirely absent. And in a lot of ways, religion has now, where, it's not in great shape, but where it continues to be, it's increasingly a phenomenon of the middle class and upper classes. It's not something that is, the poor, only high school educated are much less present in kind of religious congregations than other groups. Okay. And if you saw like the numbers, right, like it's quite low. Okay. All right. So I think is this my last slide? Oh, it is too. All right. So the number of adults, attending religious services weekly or never attending, right? And we can see the kind of switch, right? If we go back to 2008, right, there were 44, and this is Census Bureau and Cooperative Election Study again. And what we see is that, in 2008, 44 million people, or 45, let's say 45 million people were attending or never attending religious services versus 70 million, attending religious services. Now, the number of people weekly, right? Now, the number of people attending religious services weekly has dropped a little bit, right? About 8 million people, 8 million fewer people today are attending religious services. I suspect some of this, or a lot of this, is actually generational replacement, right? Older people who were attending more frequently have kind of died off, and they've not been replaced. But that growth line for the never, right, it's not quite doubled, but it's very close to having doubled, right? If it was exactly 90 million, it would have doubled. It's not quite there, but it's getting very close. So in, not quite a 20-year period, right, a 14-year period, the number of non-attenders, people who never attend religious services in the US, has almost doubled. So, and has gone from being far less, like not a little bit more than half the number of those who attended weekly to, 20 million more. And I think that's a pretty profound religious change. All right. Are we ready to talk about the nuns? I've been giving the previews on the nuns the entire course and teasing you. Are we ready? Okay. Should I keep my doodles? I should not. All right. I love doodling on charts and being blinded by the projector. Okay. Hang on. There we go. Okay. Exactly what I wanted. Except go away projector thing. Okay. So, man, we are finally at the nuns. Much promised and now to be discussed. Okay. So most of the data that I'm going to be using here, I'll always intersperse a little bit of Ryan Burge here and there, but most of it is coming from this book. It's the end of the semester and I can't talk anymore. All right, this book, a really good, really interesting book by None of the Above, Non-Religious Identity in the US and Canada by Joel Thiessen and Sarah Wilkins Laflamme. I used a lot of Sarah's graphics because she did a bunch of infographics from the Canadian Census. I used that at the beginning of the religious landscape lectures. And Joel, really nice guy, met him a couple of times. Professor at Ambrose University in Calgary, And in Canada, these are like the two big names in sociology of religion. Everyone else is just window dressing. It's a really interesting book from a couple of years ago. So let's kind of look at let's look at how this has gone. Okay, so who are the nuns, right? According to Wilkins and Laflamme, Wilkins, Laflamme, and Thiessen, the majority, they say, of religious nuns in the U.S. and Canada, they call non-verts. Non-verts, fun word. So we just need a million kind of different takes on the word nun and non to just mess with you. So I can ask questions about the non-verts and ask you what it means and then really confuse you on exam questions if you weren't paying attention. Okay, but the non-verts, right, these are people, they say, who were socialized to some extent in religion and basically deconverted at some point. However, what they say is there's also a growing cohort of what they call cradle nuns, right? Those raised with no or with anti-religious socialization, right? So we talk about cradle anything in kind of religious terms, right? If you talk about a cradle Catholic, right, this is someone who was born into a Catholic family and raised Catholic. And so now we're talking about cradle nuns, right? People born into families with no religion, whose parents were non-religious and who raised them with either no religious socialization or anti-religious socialization. And okay, what Thiessen and Laflamme say is that, yeah, as organized religion plays a smaller and smaller role in these other aspects of life. So here you should hear some echoes of like either that inherited secularization thesis or the kind of neo or revised secularization thesis, right? Maybe it's religious authority, but you should definitely hear that echo of this idea of institutional differentiation, right? That's what Thiessen and Laflamme are talking about. So as religion is playing less and less of a role in other aspects of life, right? We're no longer living in towns or city centers where your community is the church that you kind of attend or your family attends, right? As we're moving away from that and we get, schools, hospitals, etc., differentiated from religion, leaving a religion has become a more viable cultural option. Yeah, and as more people leave, it creates that snowball effect, right? As more people identify as nothing in particular, right, it becomes more viable, right? So just like anecdotally, right, a lot of people that I've talked to who are Gen Z, will say, well, I'm not religious. If you're in a peer group that, a large number of people say, oh, I'm not religious, ultimately that becomes much more viable. Yeah, Jessica.
Socialized a religion, but they weren't born into religion? Like, how would, because I can't really think of it. The first one is I'm having trouble with.
Oh, so how people go,
It's like you move to a new area, everyone's this, so you're like, yeah, I'm this, or you marry someone, and you divorce them, and you're like, okay.
I'm not sure can you just rephrase the question? I'm not sure I'm understanding your question.
So how would someone be socially raised in religion, but not a cradle nun? Or are they the same thing?
So, someone who is raised irreligiously, you mean? Or someone raised in religion who deconverts?
Yeah, the non-verts.
Oh, so non-verts basically that means you were raised socialized religiously to some extent. Now that might be you were from a super religious family, or you could be from a barely religious family, right? You could have been, socialized very lightly in religion, right? Where it's maybe your parents attended church Christmas and Easter, and then when you grow up, right, you deconvert, right? That's what that first point is kind of saying. So the non-verts are, they would have been cradle something religious, right?
Oh, okay.
And then they would have, and again, it might have been very strict or very loose. And then as they get older, you would say deconvert, or what basically Thiessen and Laflamme are saying, they're non-verts because they have converted to non, right? Or none, rather none. Right? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I don't know what I'm saying anymore. Class dismissed. No, what time? I got lots of time. Okay. Yeah, I think I covered everything here. All right, so most of the nuns, right, in Canada and the US, according to Thiessen and Laflamme, and I think this is backed up by the data from Ryan Burge, have come from the liberal mainline Protestant denominations, right? That's that chart that I re-emphasized again, right? In the US, right, that sharp downward line and that sharp upward line, right? Liberal mainline Protestant denominations. So here you should think most Lutherans, Anglicans, Episcopalians, the United Church in Canada was the biggest church, and now it basically doesn't exist. These are the denominations that have really over-contributed to the nuns. Now, the next biggest contributors are Catholics. Oops. And depending on like whose data you look at, right? Catholics, it's a fairly disastrous kind of story for Catholics, right? Roughly speaking, about half of people who were raised Catholic end up leaving Catholicism. Not all of them for nothing in particular, but a lot of them moving into either nothing in particular, atheist or agnostic. It's by their 30th birthday. It's about half of them overall. So Catholicism has a huge generational replacement problem. And like Smith and Mangloss, who did a bunch of research for the McGrath Center for Church Life at University of Notre Dame, basically suggested that Catholics, like in the US, they're about 20% of the population and have been for a really long time, but they were contributing somewhere around 40 to 50% of the nuns, depending on the year. And basically what they say is Catholics heavily over-contribute to the nuns as well. And that means, and the last major source is evangelical Protestants, though evangelical Protestantism has been much more durable until like quite recently than either mainline Protestantism or Catholicism. In Canada, those raised Buddhists have also contributed some to the nuns, right? I was actually just talking to a student from a different class who basically said they were raised Buddhist and now they're nothing in, or I think atheist, but that would fall into this category of nuns as well. Other minority faiths, Islam, Sikhism, and Hinduism contribute as well. But when it comes to Canada, the US, they remain very small populations. So their total contribution to this phenomenon itself has to be very small, right? Now, as they gather kind of population growth through immigration, that may ultimately change, and you might have more Muslim nuns or ex-Muslim nuns, I guess. But so far, right, they're a really small percentage of the population. And I think the strong presence of evangelicals in the US, right? So the fact that, like, if you look at that, the US share of population, right, somewhere between, at its height, about 30%, and at its sort of median, somewhere around 22, 23% of Americans have identified as evangelical, and that evangelicalism has been more durable, has meant that the process of nunnification, if you will, in the US has been considerably slower, just because there's evangelicalism, for whatever reason, has held together a little bit better. Okay, so religious socialization, right? If we look at our no religious affiliation, right, in gray here, so that's our gray line, and our religiously affiliated. Basically, what we see is that Canada and the US actually here don't look all that different. 56% of the nuns reported their parents had a religious affiliation, which means 44% didn't, right? So both parents had a religious affiliation. So we see that people who are, nothing in particular, basically about half of them, a little bit more than half of them in the US, had both parents with a religious affiliation, and half of them attended religious services at least once a month when 12 years old. It's a cool question. I like how that question's asked. In Canada, it's not that much different, right? For our people who are nothing in particular, both parents have, half of them, a little bit more, 55, both parents had a religious affiliation, and half of them attended religious services at least once a month when growing up. Less good question, but because it's less specific. So I like the American question better, but we're dealing with different surveys, right? Yeah, only a slim majority really were from religious homes. So it's basically when we talk about a majority, right? It's about 6% in the 56%. So it's just a slim majority were from a very religious home, right, where both parents had a religious affiliation. In Canada, it's a little bit more. So, basically a good chunk, not quite 50%, 44 and 45% were from homes where either one parent had no religion or both parents had no religion. So we are seeing kind of shifts in that. For the religiously affiliated, right, not surprising, most of them had two religious parents. Most of them attended religious services when they were young, and Canada even more so, right? 94% where both parents had a religious affiliation, and 83 attended religious services. So, pretty, that's about what you'd expect. Okay, so when does it happen? When do people disaffiliate, right? What is the story of disaffiliation? It tends to happen in late adolescence and emerging adulthood, right? And especially the younger years of emerging adulthood. In the US and Canada, the college years or university years are particularly kind of important as a moment where disaffiliation happens. Okay, so late adolescence, right? When people are late teenagers, and one of the things, I have this on another slide, but I'll just mention it here. Late adolescence is typically when parents start to give their teenage children more religious choice. And that's when a lot of them will actually choose to disaffiliate from religion, right? When their parents kind of, back off on maybe, having them attend religious services or whatever, right? Young adulthoods as well. Young adulthood, typically a time where people are, again, their parents start to treat them more as adults, right? Less as people who they can impose kind of expectations on. So that's when a lot of religious disaffiliation happens as well. The other one is, especially in the US, when people move away to attend higher education, right? That is a key moment because it breaks a lot of the social ties. And I think I mentioned this last time because I'm just reading this book on the Great Dechurching. The number one reason people give as to why they stopped attending religious services is that they moved, right? Moving and breaking those existing social ties that you've had for a long time often leads to this kind of loss of religion. Okay, I think this second point is super important, especially because if you kind of pay attention as I do, and maybe my brain is a little broken because of the sort of discourses that I'm interested in, there's a lot of talk, especially in evangelical circles, about things like ex-evangelicals or people who deconstructed their religious faith, right? And they lost their faith through some kind of intense process of deconstruction. And so we tend to think of maybe deconversion in a lot of ways as a very dramatic process as well. This, however, doesn't appear to be backed up by the data, at least for the most part. What tends to be true, and that's why I put a little bracket on it, is that the process of becoming a nun is a really slow process, right? And it's like, how did Burge describe it in that podcast? It was like, I used to go, several times a week, right? I was at youth group, and then I was in church on Sunday morning, and then, I got a part-time job, and sometimes I worked on Sunday, so maybe I went 2 or 3 times a month. And then, university and life got really busy, and so I went maybe once a month, and then, a couple times a year. And over the process of like maybe 5, 6, 7 years, people kind of slowly drift away, and they move somewhere else, right? They move, and it just kind of fades away over time. But it's far less common for it to be this sharp process, right? People end up nothing in particular. And I think that's why, when we talked about the religious landscape, nothing in particular is much more pronounced than atheist or agnostic, right? Because this process doesn't lead to atheist and agnostic. It leads to meh, right? Meh, spelled M-E-H. Meh, when it comes to religion, right? it's a sort of shrug, and I guess I have no religion. I've sort of just slowly walked away from it. Okay, so most mainline Protestants are liberal Catholic, or those from a liberal Catholic background experience what Zuckerman calls mild disaffiliation, right? So these were marginally attached, right? This is a phenomenon that Smith and Mangloss call marginal peel-off, right? Basically, typically, right, they're much less attached religiously, right? These are much more, I guess, let's put it this way, they're much less demanding religious traditions, and so people are marginally attached, and those marginal people, in this gradual process, sort of peel off and slowly end up in the ranks of the nuns, right? But, I mean, let's say good things about this is this disaffiliation is relatively untroubled, right? They don't experience this as a kind of religious shock, right? Or a big shift in their personality or their values or their beliefs. It's kind of an untroubled passing away of religion, right? They just sort of give it up slowly over time, right? It just kind of disappears from their life, and they never experience a sort of, moment where they reject religion or they go through a religious crisis. It just sort of falls away. And yeah, I mean, typically, these are not people who are overly religious to begin with. Now, as I said, there's a lot of accounts, and just like type ex-evangelical into Google, and you'll get a lot of very dramatic stories of people who are maybe former evangelicals or conservative Roman Catholics who underwent a process of disaffiliation. Those accounts tend to be much more kind of transformative and traumatic, right? Because these are people who held deep religious beliefs and ultimately went through some kind of process. They often call it deconstruction. That's a big buzzword in the kind of Christo sphere at the moment. And I've actually heard, even conservative Muslims using this term of deconstructing Islam now. So that kind of Western language has kind of infiltrated Islam as well. But it's a much more transformative and traumatic one. And because their families, on the whole, tend to be a lot more religious, it does tend to put them at odds with their families in much more profound ways than, say, if your parents are kind of here and you go to nothing in particular, they're probably not too many steps behind you in a lot of ways. But if your parents are like, top 10% most religious, and you deconstruct your religious beliefs and then walk away, that can be a profound moment of kind of family shock as well, where you're really stepping away from, profound beliefs that your family holds. How am I doing for time? I must be doing terrible. No, I'm doing great. 5 more minutes. Okay. So, most accounts of why people became nuns have at least some of the following variables. Variables. Okay, so I mentioned this one already, right? Parents give religious choice to children. Okay, that's one. Intellectual disagreements, less common, but definitely still there. Social influences. Oh, I'm just reading a paper right now, which I'd sort of considered, but I hadn't fully kind of thought about how, sorry, this is going to sound weird, but it's kind of interesting, how pornography use affects religiosity. And it's always been kind of assumed that, more religiosity leads to less porn use, but less how porn use might lower religiosity. And I'm like, oh, intriguing. Anyway, social influences, but friends here are the big ones. Friends, peer groups, romantic partners outside of your particular faith group. If you are a religiously affiliated person who starts to date someone who is not religiously affiliated, what almost always tends to happen is your religiosity ends up going down. Okay. Life transitions. There's a lot of reasons for that as well, which I don't talk about in this class, but I talk about other places. Life transitions, right? Moving, going to college, again, big ones, and irreligious socialization, right? So, in becoming a nun, if you're socialized by irreligious parents, that's going to lead to certain things. I'm just like, should I start on this? I got 3 minutes. I'll start on it. We'll see. Okay, so for those who disaffiliate, right? Parents, gave their teens or preteens the choice of continued religious involvement. This is really common. So if you look at, as I've done, kind of the literature on religious parenting, one of the things that you'll find is that there's a narrative, especially in kind of amongst U.S. religious parents, that religion should be freely chosen by children, and that somewhere in those kind of early adolescent or like preteen to teen years, it should become their active choice to become religiously involved or not, right? And so for those who disaffiliate, almost always, right, in this kind of era, they come from parents with a particular parenting philosophy that says, at some point you should be choosing this yourself. We're not going to impose it on you. And there's not going to be any parental pressure to continue affiliating. So those who disaffiliate are typically in this category. And many take this opportunity to step away, right? Sleep in longer on Sunday morning, or, have that Friday night or Saturday free, right? These are all things that, eat bacon, I don't know. These are all things that young people will do. Okay, now generally, right, those are families with low religious salience, right? Infrequent prayer, infrequent, reading of holy texts, less frequent service attendance, and religion not very often discussed in the home, right? So there's a particular kind of profile, that fits this kind of pattern, right? So here, what Thiessen and Wilkins say, or Wilkins-Laflamme say, is that, damn hyphenated names. It's like, which one do I use? Wilkins-Laflamme say is there's a really fuzzy line here between, disaffiliation and irreligious socialization, because in this category, some of this almost looks like irreligious socialization, right? You're not doing, if you were to kind of give these people, parents, a religiosity score, it would be pretty low, right? So if let's say you were doing a survey and you were asking questions like, how often do you pray, read the religious text, attend religious services, and you scored that for every person on the survey, these would be the people who are scoring kind of in the low echelons. I'm out of time. I will continue on this slide on Friday. The day of the Norse god Freya will be our friend. Okay, I'm going to keep my doodles on this one. There we go. All right, we'll see you on Friday, and we'll continue talking about the nuns.